Welcome to Tochi Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The evening began like so many others. The last orange of the sun leaking through the slatted curtains, the smell of smoke and fried onions drifting in from a neighbor's kitchen, the quiet rustle of exercise books turning under the small rechargeable lamp on the table. Ngozi stirred a pot of watery beans with a wooden spoon that had a crack she kept aligning like a prayer bead, trying to coax flavor from salt and patience. When Francis burst through the door, the room tilted. His cologne, sharp and showy, rode ahead of him like a boast. He looked, as always lately, like a man dressed to be seen. Crisp shirt, silver watch, laughter already waiting at the corner of his mouth for a joke he had told somewhere else. "So this is dinner," he scoffed, drawing out the word as if it had insulted him. Chike lifted his head. Ibuka pressed his pencil harder into his writing, trying to disappear into his sums. Ngozi kept her voice quiet, a thin cloth over a boiling pot. "We will do better next week," she said. "I have extra work on Saturday." Francis laughed, a wide, hungry sound. "Always tomorrow, Ngozi. Always your small dreams and your small work. I am tired." He began listing the ways he was tired, like someone counting coins. Tired of patching shoes, tired of praying in churches with plastic chairs, tired of borrowing prestige in rooms where men discussed deals and swallowed whiskey like blessing. "I am meant for more," he said, pacing, his voice swelling until the neighbors pretended not to hear. "But you pull me back like wet clothes on a line." He slapped the table and the lamp flickered. Chike flinched. Ibuka's pencil snapped. Ngozi swallowed 1,000 retorts shaped like all the little sacrifices that had kept this family one step ahead of shame. But the words lodged in her throat because she knew a storm understands only wind. "We are your family," she managed. "We climb together or not at all." He stared at her as if the word together was an insult. "You," Francis said, stabbing the air with a finger, "are the weight on my ankle." He threw open the cupboard, grabbed a duffel bag he barely ever used, and began to stuff it with shirts without looking at sizes. The boys watched with that cleaved attention children reserve for disasters, the part of them that wants to believe the hero will still pull the bus from the cliff. When he was done, he stood at the doorway as though it were a stage and he needed a final line. It came slick and rehearsed. "One day you will thank me," he said to Ngozi, and then to the boys. "When you want something good, you know where to find me." He flicked his wrist, displaying the watch like a spell, and left. The door banged and rattled in its frame. A few seconds later, a car horn burped twice, triumphant, and then the street swallowed the sound. In the hush that followed, the beans began to burn. Ngozi lifted the pot off the fire, set it down, and drew the boys into her arms, though neither moved at first. Chike's shoulders were iron. Ibuka's small chest hiccuped. "We'll be fine," she said, and realized that she would have to become a better locksmith for the doors of her fear, because two faces were now peering through the keyhole, searching for a father in the dust where his footprints already blew away. The first time Francis returned, he did not come home. He came to school. It was 2 weeks after the door had learned the taste of his departure. Morning assembly had barely dissolved when a rumor gusted through the compound that a sleek car had parked outside, the kind that shined in a different language. Chike was called to the gate by a shy junior who said, breathless, "Your daddy is asking for you." Outside, Francis leaned against the car, sunglasses resting in his hand like a second pair of eyes. He opened the passenger door with a flourish and placed a box of donuts on Chike's lap the way rich uncles place blessings. Generous, public, sugared. "How's my big man?" Francis asked, voice honeyed. A private show after the public humiliation of leaving. Chike's chest ballooned. He felt taller, seen. Francis launched into an easy performance. Jokes about teachers with loud chalk, promises about weekends at swimming pools, a story about a boy who rose because he stopped letting small thinking hold him back. He kept his tone conspiratorial, like a teammate whispering plays. "Your mother," he said eventually, tapping a finger on the dashboard. "She is not who you think." The donut box grew heavier as Francis spun his tale. He did not accuse loudly. He planted seeds. Before you were born, she was moving around, he said. I tried. I forgave. But how do I know, Chike? He placed a hand over his heart as if the doubt pained him nobly. How do I know you are even? He didn't finish the sentence, but the unspoken hung like smoke. He did not wait for the boy to answer. Instead, he slid an envelope into Chike's pocket, money folded and warm, the shape of a bribe disguised as a gift. For books, he said lightly. Don't tell your mother. She will only spend it on those church dues. He laughed and then softened his voice. I want the best for you, my son, but I cannot pour clean water into a leaking bucket. When he said leaking bucket, he let the words roll as if they were wise rather than cruel. He hugged Chike tightly, cologne tattooing the boy's uniform with a smell that would haunt the classroom for the rest of the day like a ghost with good taste. By afternoon, Ibuka had his own audience with the magician at the gate. For him, Francis produced a small robot toy that blinked and beeped, a silly extravagance that nevertheless shot stars through a 7-year-old's eyes. Francis knelt to Ibuka's height and spoke softly, as if sharing a bedtime story. Sometimes people lie, he said, and pretend they are saints. But God sees everything. He raised his eyebrows meaningfully. You are clever. You see too. He cupped the boy's face, the gesture tender enough to pass as love and strategic enough to count as a move in a war. When the bell rang and the boys drifted back into the hive, they carried more than gifts. They carried the idea that love might wear a clean white shirt and a watch that caught the sun. They carried the suspicion that poverty was not a season, but a punishment assigned by a mother's alleged sins. And because children do not yet know that the heart can be an unreliable historian, they wrote what they had heard into the margins of their notebooks and began slowly to tilt away from the woman who packed their lunches and toward the man who packed their pockets with the kind of warmth that melts quickly but leaves a sweet aftertaste. By evening, when Ngozi asked how their day had gone, Chike shrugged and said, fine, with a new brittle edge. Ibuka asked if they could visit the big house this weekend. Ngozi smiled through a sudden ache, sensing a draft in the room that meant the walls had moved a little further apart. The month that followed was measured in chores and prayers, in coins counted twice, in the choreography of a woman doing the work of 3 people, while carrying the silence of hurt like a bowl on her head. Ngozi woke before dawn to wash clothes for neighbors, her hands red and nicked, soap eating into the soft places between her fingers until they felt armored. She cleaned the church offices for a small stipend, humming hymns under her breath, not because she felt holy, but because sound kept her from collapsing into the empty space where companionship used to sit. In the evenings she sat at a borrowed sewing machine, turning old curtains into skirts, men's shirts into school uniforms, disasters into something like dignity. She ate standing up. She laughed with other market women with her head tilted too far back, as if the extra angle would drain the exhaustion from her eyes. She saved for everything in small jars, light, rent, books, and in the very back of the cupboard, a jar with a paper label that simply said hope. It held buttons and a strand of thread and once, briefly, 3 crisp notes before Chike asked for physics notes, and the jar volunteered itself without complaint. But love does not always arrive dressed in gratitude. The boys, newly attentive to shine and swagger, began to read their mother's thrift as failure. Chike compared his mother's careful, frayed shoes to the glossy loafers he had seen under his father's table at the restaurant where they'd met for rice and boasting. Ibuka, sweet but quick to copy, repeated phrases he did not fully understand. If you work harder, we would not be suffering like this, he said one day, small hands on small hips. And Ngozi felt a heat rise in her chest that she swallowed, because anger at a child is a kind of misdirected lightning. In the compound, whispers crept like lizards, that Francis's new woman had given him sense, that some women drag men down like anchors, that some men are meant to soar and should be allowed to leave the sandbags behind. Mama Uju, who sold tomatoes with the smooth efficiency of a general, pulled Ngozi aside one afternoon and said, without fuss, he is turning their mind. Hold your boys tight, NNE. When a stream is diverted, it will not remember the spring. Ngozi nodded and held tighter, but the boys were at the age when holding looks like nagging and guidance feels like offense. One night, after a power outage turned the neighborhood into a chorus of generators. Ngozi sat on the floor mending a tear in Chike's uniform, her eyes struggling under the lamp's stubborn glow. The boys slept on their mats, faces slack and innocent, all the sharpness of daylight dissolved into angelic lines. She allowed herself to trace the history of her marriage in the stitches. The early years when Francis laughed easily, when they conspired to build a life from nothing and called it romance. The gradual creep of envy as he watched other men leap ahead on ladders he had not found. The first lie she forgave because it came wrapped in apologies and the body's warmth. The second lie she forgave because she wanted the first forgiveness to mean something. The others that piled like plates after a party no one enjoyed. "We climbed together or not at all," she had said. Now she climbed alone, dragging two growing boys up a hill built from fees and food and the invisible labor of keeping their faces turned toward morning. She tied off the final knot, kissed the collar as if it could carry an anointing, and whispered into the darkness a plea that was not quite a prayer. Let them remember who loves them when the noise gets loud. Outside, the generators coughed and kept coughing. Inside, the lamp hummed. Between these stubborn sounds, a mother mapped the route through a forest of doubt, marking each tree with the only thing she had never run out of, a love that would keep showing up even when the audience booed. Ngozi planned the visit like a military operation built from hope and fear, rehearsing every step in her mind as she scrubbed the boys' uniforms the night before until the cloth gleamed with a tired kind of pride. She told herself she would not cry, that she would speak gently but firmly, that she would ask only for school fees and nothing else, because justice asks for only what it needs. At dawn she braided Ibuka's hairline into neat waves and brushed lint from Chike's pocket, as if precision might unlock mercy. They walked the long road to Francis's new estate together, the boys alternating between excitement and embarrassment, their strides quickening each time a sleek car hissed by like an exotic animal. At the estate's gate, a high black mouth in a high white wall, two guards lounged with the laziness of power. "Good morning," Ngozi began, voice steady, palms damp. "Please tell Oga Francis his children are here." The younger guard glanced at her once, then at the boy's scuffed shoes, and smirked as if poverty were a contagious rash. The older one pressed a button on a walkie-talkie, murmured, listened, then said to the ground, not to them, "Madam, Oga say make you no cause scene. He say you know the lawyer." Words like pebbles, tossed to bruise without leaving marks. Ngozi swallowed, kept her smile pinned in place, and tried again, this time adding more dignity to each syllable like extra starch. "Tell him it is urgent. It is about their school." The boys shifted, close enough for her to feel their breath. The guard looked almost bored as he lifted a hand and shooed the air as if moving flies. "No be my work today, tell him twice," he said. "If you know one comment for here, we get instruction. There are days humiliation arrives in little drops, and you can bend your head and pretend it is merely weather." This was not that day. The younger guard stepped forward and, with exaggerated politeness, gestured toward the road. "Madam, a beg, before you gather crowd." A quiet gathered anyway, the watchfulness of vendors, Okada riders slowing, a child pointing. One of the compound gardeners, pruner in hand, peered over a hedge, recognized the boys, and looked quickly away. The walkie-talkie crackled again, and the younger guard, eager now, lifted it to his ear. "Oga say make we close gate." The metal hummed as it rolled. The boys' faces, pressed close to the bars for one last glimpse of the big house, caught their own reflections and mistook them for other boys with the same thirsty eyes. Ngozi stood rooted for one heartbeat too long, pride warring with the practical need to retreat before spectacle turned to scandal. The gate finished its slow grind and clicked, a gentle sound that still managed to be cruel. A final sentence arrived, carried on the younger guard's grin. "Oga say make you no day, use him Pekin beg for road." The watchers tittered, sympathy cloaked in gossip's warmth. Ngozi gathered her son's hands, one smaller and sticky, one larger and stiff, and walked away with a stride she hoped looked like refusal rather than defeat. Chike's mouth hardened into a line she did not recognize. "You see," he said, not quite whispering. "You want to disgrace him. Ibuka, confused and already reciting his father's mythologies, added, "Maybe we should have come alone." Ngozi felt the sting in both remarks, like twin bee stings she could not swat, and kept walking because sometimes the only victory left is to leave before you beg in a way that makes you a stranger to yourself. They turned a corner and the big house fell out of view, replaced by shops and the same noise of a street that did not care about their drama. Only then did she let herself breathe properly, the air scraping like sandpaper. She knelt to their eye level, brushing dust from their socks with fingers that wanted to shake. "I came here today because school matters," she said. "Not because your father is a god who must be appeased." Chike looked away, toward the wall they had just left. "Gods of gates," he muttered. Ngozi stood, the weight of that casual blasphemy anchoring itself in her ribs, and pointed them homeward, a general shepherding soldiers who did not yet know the war they were in. The aftermath of the gate incident settled on their one-room home like harmattan dust, thin but everywhere, coating surfaces that used to shine with ordinary living. Conversation shrank into bare necessities. The boys learned to shape silence into a weapon sharp enough to slice through their mother's intentions. In the mornings, Chike answered her soft, "How did you sleep?" with a shrug, that peculiar teenage punctuation that dissolves care into air. At night, Ibuka claimed homework required his full attention whenever she tried to lean into him with stories, the foolish, bright kind about how she and their father once walked to the river and planned a life from a cloud shape. When Ngozi reached for their shoulders, her palms met the cool of unfamiliar sculpture. The compound added its chorus in the way only compounds can. Neighbors' doors paused half open as she walked by. Conversations adjusted their volume to catch and smuggle in her name. A woman selling akba asked with professional sweetness if Ngozi needed extra, since she had extra mouths now, and then laughed too loudly at her own joke. In church, the usher who used to squeeze Ngozi's hand during the prayers now squeezed past her in the aisle to greet wealthier congregants, perfume trailing like a small train behind approval. Even a landlord, a man who had been reliably indifferent for 7 years, found injured outrage about 2 months' late rent and threatened to install cents with a padlock unless she produced money by Friday. Ngozi found that grief, when stretched by time and sharpened by disrespect, becomes a kind of discipline. She cleaned with a new precision, as if clarity on shelves would coax clarity back into her son's eyes. She took a third job, washing plates at a bukka in the evenings for a colicky owner who shouted orders like prayers. On good nights, the owner paid in cash and leftover stew. On bad nights, she paid in stew only, and Ngozi would walk home balancing a plastic bowl of oil-bright soup like contraband hope. She learned to fix the small water pump at the borehole after a handyman demanded a service fee she could not spare. She learned to stitch holes in their socks with a knot that did not rub their ankles raw. She learned to ask for help in whispers so that the favors did not become future weapons. Through it all, she refused to speak Francis's name as a curse. When the boys baited her, if Daddy were here, he would not let us eat this watery rice, she said. "Eat, Biko, so your brains will not swim away." When Chike tossed his exercise book on the table with the swagger of someone who knows he is admired elsewhere, she opened the book and pointed at a problem in algebra, because algebra, at least, still obeyed rules that could be learned, and she had always trusted rules more than rumors. But slow poison works in children the way gossip works in markets. What begins as somebody else's voice becomes yours if you repeat it enough times. Chike started spending longer hours studying at a friend's house near the ring road, returning with the tired dazzle of boys who have seen expensive living rooms designed to dazzle boys. He acquired a slangy disrespect that made even his jokes sound like verdicts. Ibuka, eager to keep pace with his brother, began hiding his report sheets when the grade slid, then defended the slide by declaring school unnecessary hustle, when real money was clearly made by men with taste. On a Wednesday night, as a dry wind combed the tin roof and the bulb juddered with every voltage dip, Ngozi tried to describe to them the shape of their future if they kept walking this road. She spoke of doors that closed for boys without certificates, of men who used boys and spat them out, of dreams that drank discipline to grow. They listened in the way people listen to a generator, acknowledging the noise while scrolling through their phones. When she finished, Chike's response was a scalpel. Maybe the problem is that we are living your kind of life. He did not mean the words to be poetic. Still, they slid under her skin and lodged like glass. She turned away so they would not see the sting, told them to sleep, and lay awake for hours, counting the slow seconds between one breath and the next, reminding herself that love is not a contract with guaranteed deliverables, but a stubborn movement toward light, even when your companions have forgotten why you started walking. Chike's 13th birthday arrived wearing the smell of rain, that swollen, metallic promise that Lagos and Onitsha and every city with tired drains knows as both blessing and prelude to chaos. Ngozi had been saving from her night plates at the buka, tucking away small notes and coins in the jar labeled hope, and for once the word felt literal. She had planned every detail with the care of a director staging a scene that must land. A small chocolate cake from the woman on Akana Street who iced names with unsteady affection, 2 plastic cups, and a bottle of malt to share. A crisp second-hand shirt she had bargained for so fiercely that the trader had called her soldier woman, and then, smiling, knocked 50 naira off the price. She set the table that morning with a paper tablecloth she had ironed under a towel so the design would not melt, and she sang the birthday song twice while practicing where she would stand so the light from the window would not fall hard on the tired half-moons under her eyes. She wanted a picture for Chike to look at later, a picture where love was visible even if money wasn't. She texted Mama Uju to stop by after church and clap loudly. She even borrowed a small Bluetooth speaker from the neighbor's teenage daughter, promising to return it before the girls' evening dance rehearsal. The room looked, to her, like a prayer finished and placed on a windowsill to dry. Francis, master of grand gestures that hid rotten roots, chose that exact day to perform fatherhood as theater. Around noon, when the rain finally began to fall in coins and drum rolls, a car sliced through puddles and parked with the kind of ease that announces itself. A delivery man in branded polo hopped out, followed by the public relations glow of a second young man with a phone ready for content. They brought a wrapped box big enough to be a television and a shopping bag looped with designer rope handles. Chike, who had been pretending indifference toward the decorations, sprang toward the door like a child again, and then modulated into adolescent cool when he remembered the role he had been practicing. "It's from Dad," the delivery man said, loud enough for the compound to hear. The box revealed a brand new phone, the kind that made boys into small gods. The bag revealed sneakers as white as a lie and a card that smelled like expensive paper. A call followed, speaker on, Francis's voice booming silk. "Happy birthday, champion. I would have come myself, but meetings, you know. Make your mother keep her prayers. I will handle the plans for a real party next week." Laughter poured through the speaker from some distant room, where other men cheered their own echoes. Neighbors gathered with the efficient curiosity of people who understand that good drama is a community resource. Someone shouted, "Odogwu," to a man who was not there, but was somehow everywhere. The Bluetooth speaker in the room, still paired to Ngozi's phone, chimed its connection tone, and then fell silent, as if the day had chosen its music from a different playlist. The cake, a small brown planet orbiting the table, suddenly looked like a prop from a children's play about poverty. Ngozi held the knife and measured the slices, making sure the boy's pieces were bigger, ignoring how her hand trembled and made the icing let her wobble. She sang again, this time softly, a one-woman choir of cracked hope. Chike smiled with the curved arrogance of someone whose stock had risen. He snapped photos he would later caption with jokes that omitted the room's narrowness and the smell of rain seeping through a persistent leak in the window frame. He said thank you to his mother, but the words were light, tossed over his shoulder toward the phone, now glowing on the table like a little sun. When she handed him the shirt, he peeled the tape carefully, and for a second his face softened. The fabric was cool and fine, a good find, but the softness hardened when a neighbor boy yelled from the doorway, "Guy." The shoe white dye, and the room pivoted back to worship at the altar of shine. Ibuka danced a silly, happy dance in the sneaker's reflection and tripped over the speaker's cord. Everyone laughed in the good way, and Ngozi laughed too, because laughter is a muscle you must not allow to atrophy. Later, when the visitors thinned, she gathered the paper plates and the cardboard cake base and the ribbon from the shirt, smoothing it and folding it for some future use, and pressed her palm flat on the table to steady the trimmer. In bed after lights out, she heard Chike whisper into the new phone to a friend. My old woman tried, Shah. But next week, Daddy's own we go show. She turned her face to the wall and exhaled a long, slow breath that felt like surrender and decided, fiercely, that tomorrow she would rise before dawn and try again. Because that is what love does when it is mocked. It sharpens its tools, it ties its head scarf tighter, and it returns to the field where the harvest looks impossible. The sun had barely lifted its sleepy head when Mama Uju stopped by with her usual basket of garden greens, her wrapper tied high above her waist, and her voice carrying that no-nonsense weight that came from decades of surviving both poverty and people. Ngozi had been crouched over a basin of soapy water, scrubbing Ibuka's socks with a stubborn rhythm, when Mama Uju cleared her throat the way elders do when they're about to give you medicine you won't like. Ngozi, Nene, leave that sock for a moment. I need to talk to you woman to woman. Ngozi wiped her hands on her wrapper and straightened, the morning breeze carrying the faint smell of fried akra from a distant stall. Mama Uju lowered herself onto the wooden bench near the doorway and leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. These your boys, she began, her eyes sharp as broom bristles. You think they are only being stubborn, but it's more than that. Francis is turning their minds against you. She told Ngozi how she had overheard Chike at the borehole, bragging about his father's wealth and muttering that his mother held him back. She described Ibuka telling another boy that his father might not even be sure they were his real children. Ngozi's heart tightened, the air between them suddenly thick. Ngozi listened quietly, her mind pulling at the threads of every recent moment. The coldness in Chike's voice, Ibuka's sudden habit of quoting Francis, as if his father's words were scripture. She tried to defend them, murmuring that they were just children, easily impressed by shiny things. But Mama Uju shook her head. Impression is the first step to possession. Today it's phones and sneakers. Tomorrow it's their loyalty. She placed a firm hand over Ngozi's. I know you don't want to badmouth their father, but silence sometimes feeds the wrong wolf. You think you're protecting them from adult quarrels, but you're giving his lies free land in their minds. Ngozi swallowed hard. It had always been her principle not to poison her children with bitterness. She believed that truth revealed itself with time, but what if time came too late? She could already feel the shifting tide, her influence slipping like wet soap. Mama Uju's face softened. Nene, all I'm saying is hold your boys tight before the wind carries them to a place you cannot call them back from. After Mama Uju left, Ngozi sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting on her lap, staring at the uneven pattern on the floor tiles. She thought about the day Francis had left, the sharp crack in their family spine, and how she had told herself that if she worked hard enough, kept the boys fed, clothed, and in school, they would one day see the truth without her having to speak it. But perhaps she had underestimated the power of a well-dressed lie. Later that night, as she folded laundry, she watched Chike scrolling on his phone with a smirk that made him look years older, and Ibuka laughing at something on the screen. She wanted to say, "Do you know who loves you most in this world?" but the words stayed lodged in her throat. Instead, she simply said, "Time for bed," and turned off the light, her mind buzzing with the knowledge that the real battle wasn't for school fees or food. It was for the hearts of her sons, and the enemy was already in their ears. The term school fees were due, and the notice from the headmaster sat on the small table like a silent accusation. Ngozi had counted and recounted her earnings from the cleaning job, the sewing work, and the plates she washed at the bukka, but no matter how she stretched it, the money came up short. That night, after the boys were asleep, she opened the cupboard and pulled out the one thing she had kept from her days as a full-time tailor, her old black sewing machine. It was her partner in survival, the tool that had mended more than just clothes. It had stitched hope into the ragged edges of their lives. But the truth was plain. Selling it was the only way to keep the boys in school. The next morning, she walked to the market, the sewing machine balanced on her hip, like a child she was giving away. The trader who bought it haggled shamelessly, but she stood her ground just enough to leave with enough money for the fees and a little extra for food. Her relief was sharp but short-lived. When she handed the headmaster the payment, she felt a private satisfaction. the kind that comes from knowing you have moved a mountain with your bare hands. But that night, as she served beans and planning for dinner, Ibuka looked at her and asked, "Why can't you just be like Dad and make money? He never has to sell his things." Chike, not looking up from his phone, added, "Yeah, why struggle like this? You should be thinking bigger." The words stung like fresh cuts. She wanted to tell them that their father's wealth was built on choices she had refused to make, choices that traded integrity for comfort, truth for performance. But she kept her voice even, saying only, "Money is not always the proof of the right path." They rolled their eyes, a gesture they had learned from someone who spoke in gold and drove in leather. Later that week, Ngozi overheard them whispering about how Frances could easily pay the fees if she wasn't so stubborn. She stood in the doorway, her heart aching, but she didn't interrupt. She knew that confronting them now would only push them further toward him. Instead, she went to her small prayer mat that night and asked God for patience. But patience, she was learning, was not a still river. It was a rough sea you had to swim through every day, even when the current pulled against you. As she closed her eyes, she thought of the sewing machine now sitting in someone else's shop, and she prayed that someday her sons would understand the cost of keeping them in school, not just in money, but in the quiet sacrifices that had left her with little more than calloused hands and a stubborn love that refused to quit. The wedding was the kind of event where everyone came dressed to be photographed, where the air shimmered with perfume and the floor gleamed like it had been polished with ambition. Ngozi arrived quietly, wearing her best wrapper and blouse, neatly pressed but modest, her geli tied with careful precision. She came because it was a family obligation, and because the invitation, though grudging, had been extended through an older relative. But from the moment she stepped into the hall, she could feel eyes skimming over her, measuring and dismissing her in the same breath. Then she saw him. Francis was seated at a table near the stage, his new wife beside him in a dress that glimmered like wet gold, her laughter a rehearsed melody. They looked like a magazine spread, the kind meant to sell the idea that wealth was the only language worth speaking. Chike and Ibuka spotted him before she could even greet anyone. Their faces lit up, and they moved toward his table without hesitation, leaving Ngozi standing near the entrance like an afterthought. Francis welcomed them with open arms, pulling them into the glow of his world. He ordered drinks for them, leaned in to whisper things that made them grin, and posed for photos with them, the camera flashes sealing the moment like an oath. From where she sat, at a table tucked near the back with a group of distant cousins, Ngozi watched as her sons laughed and chatted, their plates heaped with food she hadn't been offered. Every now and then, Francis would glance in her direction, his smile curling in that familiar way that said he knew exactly how to wound without lifting a finger. When the music swelled and people began to dance, Francis took his new wife to the floor, their movements synchronized in a display that was equal parts performance and possession. The guests clapped and cheered, and the boys clapped too, their eyes shining as if they were watching royalty. Ngozi sipped from her bottle of water and kept her smile polite, even as a hollow space opened wider inside her. She left before the event ended, slipping out quietly while the music was still loud, so her departure would not be noticed. On the walk home, she thought about how easy it was for a man to buy loyalty with spectacle, and how much harder it was to earn it with years of unseen labor. She wondered, not for the first time, how much longer she could hold on before her sons completely crossed the invisible line that separated her from the man who had abandoned them, but still somehow owned their admiration. It began subtly, like the slow leak of water you don't notice until the floor is slick. Chike had always been the more reserved of the two boys, his emotions tucked away under a careful veneer, but lately there was a new edge to his silence, an undercurrent of calculation. Ngozi noticed small things at first, a wad of folded naira notes he brushed off as change from a friend, snacks she hadn't bought, a bus ticket from a part of town they had no reason to visit. The truth revealed itself one hot Tuesday afternoon when she went to the school to drop off some exercise books she had bought for Ibuka. While waiting outside the principal's office, she overheard two boys talking. "Chike's father gave him the money for our weekend hangout," one of them said with admiration. The other replied, "That's why he doesn't stress over home problems like us. His dad's rich." The words hit Ngozi in the gut, not because of the mention of money, but because it confirmed what she had been dreading. Frances had been slipping into her son's life like a shadow she could not block. That evening, when Chike returned home, she asked him directly, "Where are you getting extra money from?" Her tone was calm but firm, the kind that had once made him shift uncomfortably under her gaze. Now, he barely looked up from his phone. "Why does it matter? You can't provide everything we need." The words landed like stones in her chest. "I'm your mother. It matters because I want to know who is influencing you." Chike sighed as if she was the one being unreasonable. "It's from Dad. He helps me when I need it. You should be grateful someone is." The last sentence was laced with venom, and for a moment, Ngozi's hands trembled with the effort of holding her tongue. She wanted to tell him about the man who had walked away from all of them, who had left her to scrape for survival, while he paraded another woman in gold and silk. But she swallowed the urge because she knew any insult toward Frances would be twisted into proof of her bitterness. Still, the wound festered. That night, as she lay on her thin mattress, listening to the rhythmic hum of a ceiling fan, she thought about the dangers of a boy learning to measure worth in cash rather than character. She thought about the growing chasm between them and the day, which felt closer than she wanted to admit, when he might cross it entirely. Her mind went to the jar labeled Hope in the cupboard. It was nearly empty now, its coins rattling faintly whenever the cupboard door was opened. She thought about how Frances had found a way to buy a piece of her son's heart for the price of a meal or a pair of sneakers. And she wondered painfully if love without money had any currency left in the eyes of a teenager already halfway convinced that the man with the gold watch was the better parent. The scholarship opportunity came almost like an answer to a prayer Ngozi had whispered half asleep one restless night. It was through a wealthy church member, Elder Chima, who had offered to sponsor promising students from low-income families. Ngozi found out through Mama Uju, who had heard it in passing while selling tomatoes outside the church gates. She didn't waste time. The next day, she was in Elder Chima's office, clutching Ibuka's report cards and a neatly written application letter she had spent hours drafting. She spoke with humility, explaining her situation without indulging in self-pity. She painted a picture of a bright boy with potential, a boy who could shine if only given the right opportunity. Elder Chima listened thoughtfully, asking questions about Ibuka's behavior and academic consistency, and by the end of the conversation, he promised to consider the application seriously. Ngozi left that office with a strange mix of hope and fear clashing in her chest. When the scholarship was approved 2 weeks later, Ngozi felt a rush of gratitude, so intense she almost cried in the church pew the following Sunday. She came home early, eager to tell Ibuka, imagining the joy on his face, the way he would throw his arms around her in thanks. But when she shared the news, his reaction was not what she expected. "So now you're trying to compete with Dad?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "He already said he would pay for my schooling next year." Ngozi stood frozen, her smile faltering. "This isn't about competing," she said softly. "It's about making sure you have a future." But Ibuka shrugged, muttering something about not needing charity. The word stung, but she forced herself to focus on the bigger picture, that the fees were covered, that he could focus on learning. Still, the bitterness in his tone lingered in the air long after he had gone out to play football. That night, Ngozi found herself sitting outside under the faint moonlight, the compound quiet except for the distant hum of a generator. She thought about how twisted the situation had become, that her children could see love in every gesture from their father, no matter how inconsistent, yet suspect ulterior motives in her every sacrifice. She reminded herself that parenting wasn't about instant appreciation. It was about planting seeds whose growth you might never live to see. But she also knew that weeds, once rooted, could choke even the healthiest plants if left unchecked. She prayed again not just for money, but for wisdom, the kind of wisdom that could reach into her boys' hearts and pull out the lies before they became permanent truths. The argument started over something small, as these things often do. Chike had been talking for weeks about dropping out of school to work for Frances, claiming that he'd make more money in a year than any certificate could guarantee. Ngozi had brushed off the comments at first, thinking they were just empty talk. But on this particular evening, as she prepared a pot of jollof rice with the last of the month's food budget, Chike walked in with a tone that made her stop stirring. "Dad says I can start next month. I don't see why I should waste time here when I could be earning real money." She set the spoon down slowly, her pulse quickening. "You're not dropping out," she said firmly. "You will finish school." Chike laughed, not the warm laugh of a son, but the mocking laugh of someone who had already made up his mind. "And who's going to pay for it?" "You." The tension in the room thickened until even Ibuka, who had been sitting on the floor with his phone, looked up. "Chike, I have worked too hard to keep you in school for you to throw it away," Ngozi said, her voice rising despite herself. "Your father may offer quick money, but that money comes with chains you don't see yet." Chike's eyes narrowed. "You just don't want me to have a better life than you. That's the problem. You're jealous of Dad." The accusation hit her like a slap. For a moment, she saw red, not from anger alone, but from the heartbreak of knowing how deeply Francis's poison had seeped into her son's thinking. She stepped closer, her voice shaking now. "I am not jealous. I am your mother. My job is to protect you, even if you hate me for it." Chike scoffed, grabbed his phone and a backpack, and walked out the door. Hours passed without word from him. Ngozi paced the room, calling his phone only to hear it ring unanswered. Each minute stretched longer than the last, her mind conjuring images of danger in the dark. She tried to cook to distract herself, but ended up burning the rice, the acrid smell filling the air. By the time he returned late into the night, smelling faintly of alcohol and cheap cologne, she was too exhausted to argue. She simply asked if he was safe, and he muttered, "I'm fine," before disappearing into the boys' corner. Lying in bed that night, Ngozi realized the balance in her home had tipped. This wasn't just teenage rebellion. It was a battle for her children's future, and the battlefield was her own living room. The day began like any other, with Ngozi counting coins in the palm of her hand and deciding which bill could wait until next week. The kitchen was bare except for a small cup of gari, a few onions, and the stubborn faith that somehow things would stretch. She had planned to buy some yams with the last 500 Nigerian nairas she had saved from washing plates at the buka, but as she walked past the corner kiosk, a lottery seller waved at her. "Auntie, try your luck today. Big jackpot," he called, grinning like someone who had swallowed the sun. She almost kept walking. The very idea of gambling felt like an insult to her disciplined suffering. She preferred work, no matter how small the reward. But the man persisted, stepping into her path with a sheet of tickets and the ease of a salesman who smelled hesitation. "Even rich people play, Ani. You never know." She hesitated, the yam in her mind wrestling with the possibility of a miracle. Her fingers brushed the folded note in her wrapper pocket, the one she had planned for dinner. It felt ridiculous, reckless even. But a voice in her head, the same one that sometimes urged her to pause under a mango tree and just breathe, whispered, "What if?" With a half sigh, half laugh, she handed over the 500 Nigerian nairas and took the ticket, tucking it deep into her bag as though hiding a sin. The seller beamed, assuring her that luck loved people like her. She left the kiosk shaking her head, already regretting the purchase, already imagining the look on Chike's face if he knew she had wasted money that could have been spent on food. That evening, she prepared watery okra soup and swallowed her regret alongside the meal. Days passed, and she forgot about the ticket entirely until the announcement blared from a small radio in the buka where she worked. Jackpot winner for 250 Nigerian nairas, million ticket purchased at a Waka Junction kiosk. The seller's name jolted her memory. She froze, soap suds clinging to her hands as the numbers were read aloud. Each one matched hers, a perfect sequence of disbelief. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her knees weak enough to fold. The other workers noticed her expression and asked what was wrong, but she could barely speak. She excused herself, clutching her bag to her chest as if someone might snatch the miracle away. By the time she reached home, the reality was setting in like a sunrise. She, Ngozi, who had fought through years of scarcity, who had been abandoned, ridiculed, and doubted, was now a millionaire. She sat on her bed, ticket in hand, the weight of it both intoxicating and terrifying, and whispered, "Thank you, God." But even in that moment, she felt a shiver run down her spine, as though somewhere far away, the sound of footsteps had begun heading toward her door. The news spread faster than she could have imagined. It wasn't just her name in the papers. It was her face, smiling awkwardly in a borrowed blouse, holding the oversized check with a lottery official grinning beside her. The compound erupted with congratulations, each one tinged with curiosity about what she would do with so much money. Neighbors who had barely greeted her before were now offering to help manage her new life. Mama Uju hugged her so tightly she nearly lost her breath, warning her in the same embrace, "NNE, blessings attract flies. Keep your food covered." But not everyone's congratulations rang true. Within hours, Chike and Ibuka were at her side, their sudden warmth almost overwhelming. Chike talked about helping her invest in land and cars. Ibuka suggested hiring a driver, so you don't stress yourself. They insisted on staying close to her, hovering in ways they never had before. Francis heard before the week was over. He called, his voice dripping with the kind of charm she remembered from their earliest days. "Ngozi, my dear, congratulations. I'm so proud of you. This is a sign from God that our family is blessed." She almost laughed at the audacity. He had not called her my dear in over a decade. He spoke as if he had been part of her struggles, as if his absence hadn't been one of her greatest burdens. But before she could cut the conversation short, he shifted the tone. "We need to sit down and talk about how best to handle this money. You know, for the children's future." It was less a suggestion than a declaration. She politely declined, citing that she already had plans. But she could hear the irritation beneath his smooth words. The boys began spending more time at home, their voices softer, their requests more carefully framed. Chike offered to accompany her to the bank. Ibuka volunteered to help with any shopping she needed. At first, Ngozi allowed herself to believe that perhaps the money had simply bridged the gap between them. But late one night, she overheard them talking in hushed tones, their words threading together like the start of a dangerous plan. "If we do this right, she'll have to put everything in our names," Chike whispered. "And then, well, we won't have to wait." Ibuka didn't reply immediately, but his silence spoke louder than consent. Ngozi lay awake for hours afterward, staring at the ceiling, her joy now shadowed by the creeping awareness that the money that should have brought them closer might instead become the weapon that pushed them to destroy her. He didn't just come back. He arrived as if he had never left. Francis strolled into the compound one afternoon, dressed in a crisp white kaftan that caught the sunlight like it was spun from water, his gold wristwatch flashing at every gesture. Neighbors peeked from doorways, their eyes darting between him and Ngozi, who was seated outside peeling yams. "Ngozi," he said, his voice warm, familiar, and practiced, "you look beautiful." The compliment slid over her like oil, smooth but impossible to grip. She stood slowly, meeting his gaze without smiling. "Francis, what are you doing here?" He spread his hands, feigning innocence. "I came to see my children. And you. We are family after all." His eyes flicked toward the boys, who had already scrambled to his side, grinning like they had been waiting for this exact moment. He stayed for hours, talking as though the past years had been nothing more than a brief misunderstanding. He asked about her plans for the lottery money, offering unsolicited advice about investments, land purchases, and keeping greedy people away. When she reminded him that she was perfectly capable of managing her own affairs, he chuckled, patting her hand like a man humoring a stubborn child. "Ngozi, you've done well to get this far. But this is big money. It needs a man's guidance." She felt the old anger stir in her chest, but forced herself to keep her voice level. "This is my money, Francis. I will handle it." His smile tightened, but he didn't push further. Instead, he shifted to the boys, asking them about school and their ambitions, slipping in comments about how he could set them up with businesses right away if they wanted. By the time he left, the air in the room felt heavier. Chike and Ibuka were practically glowing, speaking about their father's big plans, and how lucky they were to have him looking out for them. Ngozi listened, her heart sinking deeper with every word. She could see the invisible threads Francis was weaving, pulling her sons further into his orbit. That night, after they had gone to bed, she sat alone at the table, the yam peels from earlier still in the bowl. She thought about how quickly old wounds could be reopened, how easily charm could be mistaken for care, and how dangerous it was to have both money and betrayal circling so close to home. For the first time since winning the lottery, she felt a tremor of fear, not about losing the money, but about losing the only two people she had fought her whole life to protect. The first major purchase wasn't even hers. It was Chike's idea, a shiny two-story house in an upscale neighborhood, so people will respect us. At first, Ngozi resisted. She had planned to clear her debts, invest in small rental properties, and set aside a secure education fund for the boys. But they argued relentlessly, Ibuka backing up Chike's every word, until she gave in to the idea of moving, telling herself that perhaps a fresh start would bring the family closer. The house was undeniably beautiful. Wide windows that drank sunlight, a tiled driveway, and a kitchen so spacious she felt lost in it. But as the paint dried, the spending began to spiral. Chike suggested a luxury SUV for comfort. Ibuka wanted the latest gaming console for the stress of school. Every request was framed as a necessity, their tone laced with the unspoken threat that refusing them would make her seem ungrateful for their sudden support in managing her life. The party started small, a few friends, loud music, laughter spilling into the night, but soon they became full-scale gatherings, with strangers spilling drinks on imported rugs and leaving cigarette burns on the balcony railing. Ngozi would return from the bank or market to find her new home transformed into a playground for people she didn't know, expensive bottles of liquor lined up like trophies, and the boys basking in the glow of popularity bought with her money. When she confronted them, Chike laughed it off. "This is what success looks like, Mum. You should relax." Ibuka added, "People will take us seriously if they see we're living large." The word "us" rang in her ears. It was never you anymore. She began to feel like a guest in her own home, her quiet corners invaded by noise and entitlement. One afternoon, she walked into the living room to find a stranger lounging on her couch, his feet on the glass table, scrolling through his phone. "Who are you?" she asked. Without looking up, he smirked, "Chike's guy." That night, she called the boys into the dining room, her voice steady, but her hands clenched under the table. She told them that the money was not endless, that she had responsibilities beyond their wants. But instead of listening, Chike's jaw tightened. "Why are you talking like you own it all? We're your children. Whatever you have is ours too." The conversation ended with him storming out, Ibuka following close behind. Ngozi sat alone at the table, her untouched dinner cooling in front of her, realizing that wealth hadn't brought them together. It had only given their distance more room to grow. The request came on a Saturday morning, casual but loaded. Chike and Ibuka wanted 15 million Nigerian nairas for an investment opportunity a friend had pitched to them. "It's a sure deal," Chike said, leaning against the kitchen counter like a salesman. "Double the money in 6 months. Ngozi didn't even let him finish before shaking her head. "No, you don't gamble with that kind of money, and certainly not with someone you barely know." Ibuka rolled his eyes. "You just don't trust us. You think we're kids." She set down the dish towel and looked at them both squarely. "Trust is earned, and right now, you're not showing me you can handle this responsibility." The silence that followed was thick, the kind that swells just before it breaks. Chike muttered something under his breath, and Ibuka gave him a sharp look as if to say, "Not yet." From that day, the warmth, however thin, that had existed between them began to curdle. They still smiled, still asked how she was, but the words felt mechanical, rehearsed. She caught them whispering in corners, their eyes darting toward her whenever she entered the room. Sometimes they would stop talking entirely, replacing conversation with the hum of the television. Other times, she'd hear fragments that sent chills down her spine. "If she keeps blocking us, we'll never get ahead," Chike once hissed. "There are other ways," Ibuka replied, his voice low but steady. She told herself they were just venting, that they wouldn't cross any line, but deep down, something in her knew the air had changed. That evening, she confided in Mama Uju, who frowned and stirred her pot of soup with more force than necessary. Ngozi, money has a way of showing you people's true hearts, even your children's. Keep your eyes open and pray. This is the season where you must be as wise as a serpent but harmless as a dove. Ngozi nodded, but the advice felt like a thread trying to hold together a cloth already tearing. That night, lying in the vast, quiet bedroom of her new house, she stared at the ceiling fan spinning lazily and wondered what her life had become. She had fought for years for her sons to have a better future, yet here she was, feeling more alone than she ever had in the cramped one-room apartment of the past. It was Ibuka who brought the plan into focus, though Chike's frustration had been steering them toward it for weeks. They met in the garage late one night, the smell of motor oil thick in the air, their voices a low murmur over the hum of the neighborhood generators. "If we wait for her to hand it over, we'll be old men before we see anything," Chike said, pacing. "She's too stubborn. She'll waste it all on safe nonsense." Ibuka hesitated, his gaze fixed on the floor. "So what are you saying?" Chike stopped pacing, his tone sharp. "We make it look like an accident." The words hung there, heavy and ugly. Ibuka swallowed hard. "How?" That's when Chike mentioned the shady friend from their party crowd, a man who, according to Chike, handled problems for the right price. They arranged to meet him the next day in a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town. He listened without flinching, sipping his beer slowly, as if they were discussing something as ordinary as a business deal. "Break failure," he suggested. "Quick, clean, no suspicion." Chike nodded immediately, but Ibuka's face betrayed his unease. Still, neither of them said no. The man named his price and told them exactly what he would need. "Just make sure she's driving alone," he said, "and not too far from home. That way, help will take long to arrive." They left the bar with their hands shoved deep into their pockets, their silence more damning than any confession. That night, Ngozi noticed they were quieter than usual, but she chalked it up to fatigue. She moved through the house, turning off lights, checking the locks, and praying in her heart the way she always did before bed. In the garage, the boys' whispered voices from earlier still seemed to cling to the walls, as if the concrete had absorbed their intent. Upstairs, they lay in their rooms, each staring at the ceiling, their minds rehearsing the details of a plan they couldn't take back once set in motion. Somewhere in the stillness, the line between desperation and cruelty blurred completely. And in that blur, a mother's life, the same life that had carried them through hunger, humiliation, and heartbreak, had just been marked for erasure by the very children she had given everything to protect. The Sunday morning air was crisp, the kind that usually made Ngozi feel alive as she prepared for church. She hummed quietly while getting dressed, choosing her modest cream lace dress and the matching head tie she had ironed the night before. Her plan was to drive to the early service, meet with the women's fellowship afterward, and return before midday to finish cooking. What she didn't know was that, in the garage, her car had been turned into a trap. The boys had been up before dawn, pretending to watch football highlights while waiting for her to retreat to her room. When the house was still, Chike slipped outside with the shady friend, tools in hand. Ibuka kept watch from the kitchen window, heart thudding in his chest, as every clink of metal seemed to echo too loudly. It took less than 10 minutes to tamper with the brake lines. When Ngozi announced she was leaving, Chike offered to open the gate for her, his tone unusually cheerful. Ibuka, in what he told himself was an act of subtle courage, offered to ride along for company. He convinced himself that if something went wrong, he'd find a way to help her. As they drove through the quiet streets, Ngozi chatted about the sermon she hoped the pastor would preach, blissfully unaware of the danger coiled beneath her feet. They were halfway to the church when the first sign appeared. The brake pedal felt soft, spongy. She pressed it again. The car didn't slow. Panic flared in her eyes as she gripped the wheel. "Something's wrong," she said, voice tightening. Ibuka's stomach dropped. The road ahead curved sharply, and a fruit vendor's stall sat dangerously close to the bend. He shouted, "Turn into that dirt path." The car jolted violently as Ngozi swerved, missing the stall by inches. But the sudden maneuver sent the vehicle skidding into a shallow ditch, slamming the front wheel against a rock. Ibuka's head hit the dashboard before he could brace himself. Pain shot through his skull, and a metallic taste filled his mouth. In the stillness after the crash, the only sound was Ngozi's ragged breathing. She scrambled out of the car, her hands trembling as she tried to reach him. "Ibuka, talk to me." His groan was faint, but it was enough to confirm he was alive. People from nearby shops rushed to help, pulling them from the wreck. As Ngozi sat on the dusty roadside cradling her injured son, she had no idea that the person who had almost died in her arms was never the intended victim. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and whispered urgency. Ibuka lay on a narrow bed, his forehead stitched, his arm in a sling. He had a mild concussion and bruised ribs, but the doctor assured Ngozi he would recover with rest. Chike arrived an hour later, feigning shock at the news. "What happened?" he asked, his voice steady but his eyes darting away from hers. Ngozi explained the brake failure, still too shaken to notice the stiffness in his body. It wasn't until later that evening, when Mama Uju visited, that the first thread of the truth began to unravel. She took Ngozi aside, her face grim. "I don't want to alarm you any, but someone in the compound overheard Chike and Ibuka talking to that no-good friend of theirs last week. It didn't sound right. They said something about getting it over with death." The words hit Ngozi harder than the crash had. She refused to believe it at first, shaking her head. "They are my children." They wouldn't, but memories flooded in. The hushed conversations, the strange warmth after the lottery win, the growing impatience. She looked through the small glass window at Ibuka, asleep under the dim ward light, and her chest tightened. Could her own sons have planned to kill her? When she returned to the ward, Chike was sitting by the bed, staring at his brother. His face was pale, his jaw clenched. Without looking at her, he said quietly, "It wasn't supposed to be him." The confession, raw and unguarded, sucked the air from the room. Ngozi felt her knees weaken. She lowered herself into the chair opposite him, her hands trembling. "Why?" she asked, the word breaking in her throat. Chike's voice cracked. We thought if you were gone, everything would come to us. Dad always said. He made it sound like you'd waste it. I thought." He trailed off, unable to finish. Ibuka stirred in the bed, opening his eyes just enough to whisper, "I didn't want a mama, but I didn't stop it." Tears burned her eyes, spilling down her cheeks, unchecked. In that moment, she understood the full weight of Francis's lies, how they had poisoned her sons until they could no longer see her love for what it was. She reached for Ibuka's uninjured hand, then looked at Chike. "You almost killed the only person who would have died for you without question," she said, her voice steady despite the quake in her heart. Whether forgiveness was possible, she didn't know. But as she sat between them, she knew one truth would never change. She had carried them through storms, and somehow she would carry herself through this one, even if she had to do it alone. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.